Well, another very warm welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel, and as we take a look at more vintage racers from the past and relive those golden days of when these old vintage racers ruled the racetracks. Now, if you haven't already subscribed to my channel, I do hope you will consider doing that in the future, and if you like my content that I'm putting out here on my YouTube channel, I do hope you will hit that like button, or even better still, subscribe, because that way you won't miss out on any future videos that I post here on CDB TV, because we have some fantastic bikes coming up in the following weeks and months. Okay, right now we're going to press on with another look at another quite rare machine, and this one is another bike from the Terry Pickering classic dirt bike collection. Now, this is a quite rare German manufactured machine, and these are not as well known as many of the other European manufacturers of their day. So without any further delay, let's just jump straight into the clip and take a look at Terry Pickering's 1981 250 Kramer twin shocker. Now, normally when we take a look at vintage dirt bikes from Terry's collection, they're either as good as brand new machines, or they've been fully stripped and then restored to look like new once again. Although in this particular case, this featured 1981 250 Kramer is a bike that Terry actually bought just to add to his collection. And as far as I'm aware, the bike is more or less in its standard stock condition and is pretty much in the same form from its 1980s production year. Although the background and the history of Kramer motorcycles is a bit sketchy and not too readily available when you research its past, but I'll try and tell you what I know. Now, Fritz Kramer from the Laubisbach region of Germany actually ran a motorcycle business that was originally established by his father, and not only was he a motorcycle dealer, he was quite a successful motocross and enduro rider also, and at that time he sold and raced German DKW motorbikes. Now, Kramer then did a deal with Meiko in which their future motorcycles would become known as Kramer Meikos, and around 50 to 80 of the Kramer Meikos were then made between 1975 and 1976. Now, it was in 1977 that Kramer then began fitting Rotax motors into their race bikes, and by then they simply called the bikes Kramers, and these were quite successful, with most of them being sold in Central Europe and in France in particular, where they were hugely popular at that time. But around the same time that our featured 250 model appeared on the scene, Kramer were in serious financial difficulties, and they soon closed down, which they say was due to non-payment by its French importers. Now, sometime later, the Kramer company was once again resurrected in Italy, where it then became known as Kramer Italia, or Kramer IT, as it became titled in 1982. And although the chassis were still made by Kramer, they continued to use the Austrian Rotax two-stroke engine. Now, it was a guy called Peter Heuser who purchased the remains of the German Kramer name, as he at that time was an importer and distributor of Kramer motorcycles. And although he did try in vain to re-establish these Kramers back into the motocross world stage, sometime later, and facing financial ruin, sadly, Peter Heuser then committed suicide, and the Kramer name also vanished into obscurity. Now, as you're no doubt already aware, most of these Kramer motorbikes were fitted with this Austrian-made Rotax two-stroke motor, which were hugely popular with many European motorcycle manufacturers of the 1970s and 1980s, and these very powerful and reliable power plants were also used by other companies, including Cotton EMX, SWM, ATK, and even Puch, to name just a few. But it's because these engines had such a good reputation for their power output and ruggedness that so many bike manufacturers used them in their machines. Now, most of the engine's casings were made from light cast magnesium, and they also had that very unique disc valve fuel induction system, which normally consisted of a rotating fibre disc on the left-hand side of the crankshaft that rotated past an open inlet track in the casing, and every time the disc passed that inlet opening, suction was formed and the fuel-air mixture was then sucked into the cylinder. And although it's quite hard to see in this particular shot on Terry's bike here, it's fed by a modern style Mikuni carburetor. But these disc valve induction systems were also used on small Yamaha road bikes of the late 1970s, but in terms of a motor that was being used for an off-road bike, these two-stroke Rotax engines were perfectly suited to these kind of motocrossers because, as I said, they were light and they were powerful, and if looked after, they were ultra reliable, which is little wonder they were so popular all over Europe. Now, at the bike's front end, now as far as I'm aware, and don't actually quote me on this particular point because I'm not exactly sure, but back in the day I think these 250 Kramers were fitted with a pair of Italian Marzocchi front forks, which again were a decent suspension system for a light 250 bike such as our Kramer, but these Marzocchis had a decent amount of travel to help soak up any jumps and bumps that the bike would encounter on the track. Of course, because this was still the early 1980s, they also still had the old school drum brakes fitted to the front and rear of the bike. Although these forks never really had much scope for any adjustment to the rebound or damping in 1981, although you could help matters by experimenting with different weights of oil, and you could also stiffen or soften the forks by adding or removing air through these Schrader valves on the top of each fork leg. Now, if you are setting your eyes on one of these Kramers for the very first time, it's not unusual for people to assume that these are later evolution type bikes with a single shock rear suspension system, but of course that's not true, because these Kramers were of course twin shock racers, as it had a set of twin shock rear suspension units tucked up neatly underneath the bike seat. Now, although it's quite hard to see from this angle, there are a pair of twin shock rear suspension units sitting side by side just behind this side panel. And actually, back in the day, I did have a friend that I knew who raced one of these Kramer bikes, and he was always being questioned by scrutineers at race events about these Kramers' eligibility as a twin shock race bike, because unless you actually took a look underneath the bike's rear end, you'd still think that it was a more modern evolution type machine. And although, to be fair, the actual chassis on these Kramers was very well made and extremely light, and coupled with that feather-light 250 Rotax motor, this was a very light and very flickable 250 racer, and it was comparable in weight to some of the smaller 125 bikes of its day. Now, once again, because this was the early 1980s, almost all off-road bikes of this period were now using these polyethylene or plastic fuel tanks on their motocrossers, and Kramer were certainly no different in that respect. And this particular fuel cell usually held more than enough race gas to feed that 250 two-stroke motor with its fuel. Now these were also fitted with a standard breathable screw-on plastic petrol cap. Now once again, and as far as I'm aware, most of this bike's controls are original and period correct for 1981, and I don't think there's too much of this bike that isn't as it was from that 80s era, because there aren't too many of these old German Kramers going around now, which is a bit of a shame, because for their day these were excellent little racers, and I think the only non-original part on this bike might be this emergency kill switch next to the throttle gasser, which is usually a legal requirement for classic race bikes to take part in Scottish vintage race events. Now, as far as comfort goes, the seat on these old Kramers was quite plush and comfortable, and was certainly a nice place to rest your backside on between the jumps and bumps on the track, although at the end of the day this was still an off-road motocross racing motorcycle and not an armchair, so comfort was really just a secondary consideration when you were building and designing one of these off-road bikes. Now Terry's Kramer once again, quite surprisingly, still has its original exhaust expansion chamber fitted from the Kramer factory back in the day, but again, because these Kramers were only in production for just a few years, it's not surprising that no pattern replacement parts were ever made for them due to their extremely short production run. But this pipe on our particular example doesn't look like it's seen much racing action on the track, with very few dings or dents to show that it's been in the motocross wars. But of course, Kramer yet again were another of the smaller European bike manufacturers that were in the 1980s producing a highly competitive product, because these bikes, as I said, were very fast, very light, and they were very agile if you wanted to throw them around a racetrack. And although official importers like the great Peter Heuser, who bought over the Kramer factory and tried his very best to keep the Kramer name alive, but of course paid the ultimate price by taking his own life due to financial ruin. But for me personally, these Kramer machines could have gone on to greater things had the circumstances of the company been different. But as you know, the Kramer's story is quite typical and similar to many of the other smaller European bike manufacturers of the 1970s and 80s, who were all building fantastic motorcycles but had their own individual problems with finances and, of course, trying to compete with the massive influx of cheaper Japanese products. Well, there you have it. I do hope you enjoyed that quite brief look around another one of the Terry Pickering classic dirt bikes, and that was his 1981 250 Kramer, and quite an original looking bike from back in the day. And it's of course one of those bikes that Terry hasn't restored and is in quite original looking condition. Okay, coming up on my channel soon, we will be taking a look at this quite nice looking 1979 KX250 Kawasaki. Now, this is a bike that I spotted on my travels during the recent Westmoreland Golden Jubilee event in 2021, and we'll be taking a look at this lovely Kawasaki when we return to post another video here on my channel. But of course, until then, everybody continue to watch what you're doing out there when you're riding those old vintage race bikes, because we'd like to see you back here once again when we all get together to talk about more vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.